If you were a teenager in America between 2005 and 2008, your social status wasn't defined by a blue text bubble. It was defined by hardware. While business executives clung to their BlackBerries, the cultural vanguard, the musicians, the trendsetters, the high schoolers carried something else. Something that felt less like a tool and more like a statement. It was the era before the black glass rectangle took over. An era where phones had personality, buttons you could feel, and a dedicated purpose. And the undisputed king of that cool factor was a strange, hyphenated hybrid, Sony Ericsson. They had everything. They owned mobile music before Spotify. They owned mobile photography before Instagram. They even had the keys to the PlayStation kingdom. They should have been the ones to invent the modern smartphone era. Instead, they completely vanished. This isn't just a story about losing to Apple. It's a story of a corporate civil war, brilliant engineering sabotaged by internal politics, and a spectacular failure to see the future they helped create. This is the rise and tragic fall of Sony Ericsson. To understand the fall, we have to understand the unlikely union that started it all. Turn back the clock to 2000. The mobile landscape was dominated by Nokia and Motorola. Ericsson, a Swedish telecommunications giant known for building unbreakable network infrastructure, was struggling in the consumer handset market. Their phones were competent but boring. Then, a disaster, literally. A massive fire at a Philips microchip plant in New Mexico halted Ericsson's production. They needed a lifeline. Enter Sony, the Japanese consumer electronics titan, the company behind the Walkman, the Trinitron TV, and the PlayStation. Sony knew how to make technology desirable, but they had almost no foothold in the mobile telecom space. In October 2001, a joint venture was formed. It was a marriage of convenience. Swedish engineering practicality meets Japanese consumer flair. It was a massive gamble. For the first 2 years, the company bled money. Critics called it two drowning giants clutching each other. But then came 2003, the turning point, the T610. In the US market, this device was a revelation. It was sleek, it had Bluetooth, and crucially, it was one of the first phones to integrate a camera in a way that didn't feel like a cheap add-on. It was the moment the mobile phone stopped being just a telephone and started becoming a multimedia device. The gamble paid off. From 2003 to 2007, Sony Ericsson entered a golden age. They didn't try to beat Nokia at making phones for everyone. They carved out a lucrative niche, the premium specialist. If you loved music, you bought a Walkman phone, complete with better earbuds than an iPod. If you loved photos, you bought a CyberShot phone, complete with a real xenon flash. They were profitable. They were cool. They were cultural icons. In 2006, James Bond wasn't using an iPhone. He was using a Sony Ericsson K800i in Casino Royale. But beneath this glittering surface, the foundation was already cracking. The joint venture structure, a 50-50 split, meant the company had two dads, and those dads were starting to fight. By 2007, Sony Ericsson was the fourth largest mobile phone manufacturer in the world, but they were about to face two threats simultaneously, one external and one brutally internal. The external threat is the one everyone knows. January 9th, 2007. Steve Jobs walks onto a stage in San Francisco and introduces the iPhone. Almost overnight, the paradigm shifted. The hardware buttons that Sony Ericsson perfected, the joysticks, the specialized music keys, became obsolete liabilities. The value moved from hardware to software, a language Sony Ericsson didn't speak fluently. They clung to their aging operating systems, Symbian and UIQ, which felt like dinosaurs compared to iOS. But the external threat might have been survivable if not for the internal threat, sabotage. Reports from former executives paint a picture of a paralyzed company. Decisions required consensus between the pragmatic Swedes and the hierarchical Japanese structure. But the biggest issue was cannibalization fear within Sony Corporation itself. Think about it. Sony Ericsson was making incredibly good music phones. Who wouldn't like that? Sony's own Walkman division, which still sold standalone MP3 players. They feared the phones were too good and were eating into their sales. The same happened with cameras. Why would Sony's CyberShot camera division want a phone that took perfect pictures? There are strong indications that Sony Ericsson devices were intentionally held back by their parent company. Features were delayed or watered down to protect legacy businesses. While Apple was consolidating everything into one device, Sony was actively trying to keep them separate. The tragic culmination of this dysfunction was the Xperia Play in 2011. On paper, this was the holy grail, the PlayStation phone, the device that would finally merge Sony's gaming dominance with mobile. But when it launched in the US, notably on Verizon, it was a disaster. It was underpowered, the screen was dim, but worst of all, it had almost no support from Sony PlayStation. There were barely any good games. The Civil War meant that the PlayStation division didn't want to give their best titles to a mobile phone division they didn't fully control. The Xperia Play wasn't killed by competitors, it was starved to death by its own family. By 2009, the internal sabotage had done its damage, but the company wasn't dead yet. They entered what can only be described as a frantic identity crisis. They knew their old operating system was obsolete, so they did what a panicked swimmer does. They started flailing. First, they tried Windows Mobile. Then they tried Symbian again with the Satio, a 12-megapixel monster that was impressive on paper, but a nightmare to use. Finally, they begrudgingly turned to Google's Android. But here is where they made their fatal mistake in the United States. In America, phone manufacturers don't sell phones to people, they sell them to carriers. If you weren't on the shelf at AT&T or Verizon, you didn't exist. While Samsung and Motorola were aggressively striking deals with US carriers, adapting their phones to American tastes, Sony Ericsson remained stubborn. They often released phones in the US months after Europe, or worse, sold them only as unlocked devices at full price. To the average American consumer, walking into a store in 2010, Sony Ericsson had become a ghost. When they finally released their first flagship Android phone, the Xperia X10, it was beautiful. But it shipped with an outdated version of Android and a heavy, laggy interface called Timescape. It was a classic case of style over substance. They were still trying to be the cool design company in an era where users just wanted a phone that worked fast. They were late to the party, wearing the wrong clothes, and they forgot to bring an invitation for the American carriers. The door was slammed shut, By 2011, the writing was on the wall. The joint venture had posted massive losses. Their market share had evaporated. In October of that year, Sony announced it was buying out Ericsson's 50% stake for over $1 billion. The marriage was over. The green and silver liquid logo was retired. Sony tried to forge ahead alone with the Xperia line, but the momentum was gone. Samsung and Apple had already divided the world between them. The fall of Sony Ericsson is a masterclass in corporate hubris. They were pioneers who got complacent. They were a company that had all the right ingredients, music, imaging, gaming, decades before competitors, but lacked the unified vision to cook the meal. They were too busy fighting internal battles to notice the meteor heading their way. Yet for a generation of American users, there is a lingering nostalgia for these devices. A longing for a time when phones were weird, specialized, and fun. Sony Ericsson didn't just make phones. For a brief, shining moment, they made the coolest artifacts of the 2000s. And then, like a dropped call, they were gone.